Well, let's get started. We're a little late. Sorry. Thanks for your patience. All right. So our opening psalm this morning is Psalm 104, verses 1 through 3. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord, my God, how excellent is your greatness. You are clothed with majesty and splendor. You wrap yourself with light as with a cloak and spread out the heavens like a curtain. You lay the beams of your chambers in the waters above. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. It's just a lovely way to start. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just picturing all of the beautiful sunrises and sunsets and
And some doozies last week.
just the glory of nature comes through it.
Right. So the book suggests that as we look at God's creation today, imagine God's light. That's good. All right. Okay, so the book of James. So for those of you who haven't been here before, Jacob is really the name. It got anglicized to James back about the time that the King James Bible was printed. So that's why we are saying Jacob James. So we are in the middle of the book. We are in chapter 3. All right. And so does anybody remember what we talked about last week? It was a week ago.
Yeah, that's my reaction.
One of the big
Oh,
theological
yeah, the
debates.
works versus faith.
Yes.
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 And my favorite thing that I remember coming out of that, because I did teach it, you think I was that you're not saved by works, you're saved for works.
And we talked about whether or not praying was considered a work.
Yeah, we did. We got into it.
The cloistered community.
Right.
See, it's coming back.
There's little bits and pieces. Thank you.
And
We learned that teachers were judged more critically.
we're
Yes, we
getting to that
did.
today.
We did
We're
that.
gonna that starts today. So, and that maybe that works versus faith as far as whether we're justified. Maybe it's not as black and white as it gets presented by James himself in in verse 24, 2:24. You now see that it is by deeds and not only by believing that someone is justified. And then in 26, as a body without a spirit is dead, so is faith without deeds. And we kind of talked before about how that's kind of a natural fit.
Yeah.
That, the works come out of your faith. It's my perspective, and I don't know if anybody else wants to.
We talked about each person having their own gifts, and part of that is acting on those gifts. And for some people, prayer is the gift, and for some people, teaching is the gift, and for some people, going out. There are all sorts of gifts that we need to recognize and support.
Yeah.
And I remember 30 years ago, probably, I went searching for, I was here, but I kind of wanted something like this class that didn't exist. So I went and visited some interesting congregations. And
I want to know what interesting means.
well, the Unitarian, the
Oh,
Unity,
yeah, the Unitarian.
hearing God referred to as it was just way too uncomfortable for me. I mean, even though I get it, it just sounded disrespectful.
Oh, I love the congregations I've gone into, I love the prayers that I've heard were referring to God as her and she.
Yeah, that's okay. That I could. But what kept me here is the works of this congregation, the outreach, because the smaller congregations, because I was visiting places even smaller than this. I grew up in a place the size of so this is a small church.
Oh gosh.
Oh yeah, I grew up at Newbridge Baptist Church out in Holland Springs. If you're at all familiar with,
Which is now an alternative ed center.
Yes, but Newbridge Baptist Church still exists. It's just further out into the county. And but yeah, they didn't have any.
We still see you.
Yeah, we still see you.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe.
All right, because we were seeing a message that wasn't making sense. So keep talking to us. Are you there?
1,
Yeah,
2,
we're
3,
good.
4, 5.
We're
Good
good.
morning, teacher.
We hear you.
All right. That was a Zoom issue, apparently. Okay, so anyhow,
So anyhow,
the works of this congregation kept you here.
and that's why my favorite committee is church and community.
Cool. Mine too. Yep. All right. Okay. So, moving into chapter 3. Remember we talked before about how in chapter 1, James, the author, gives sort of a preview of what's we're going to be talking about. And he talked about speech and language and our use of words and stuff a little bit, but there were some references in chapter 1. Well, here in chapter 3, he really gets into it. All right. So the commentary titles this section responsible language. My Bible titles it uncontrollable language.
That's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I know. So that's just to show you that those subtitles in the Bible are not part of the scripture.
I don't have subtitles.
Yeah, some translations don't, but some a lot do. So anyhow, would someone read chapter 3, verses 1 through 12? And before we get onto the soapbox about teachers, because it starts off speaking about teachers, it's thought that he references teachers because their vocation is talking language. So
If I can read. 10:30 anyway.
okay, all right, thanks, Catherine.
Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with the bridle. If we put bits in the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships, though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and it is itself set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father. With it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh.
We were just talking about that.
Zip.
We were talking.
Yeah.
Before we came in, we were talking about cruelty, sarcasm, how people take that almost as an art form, and just practice it as a general without realizing.
The hurtfulness
hurt
that
that's behind it.
comes, that's like when people are just, no, that's, yeah.
Yeah, even some types of humor come across.
Yeah, same way.
Right.
And I would, it's like my inclination is to want to disagree that, people can say bad things and be cruel sometimes and be very kind at other times. But what that teaches us is not to trust that person. And that's where I think they're coming into like the brackish water thing, is that if a person does a whole lot of, snapping and cursing and whatever, and then they turn around and start being very, very kind, it's almost like an alcoholic parent. You don't know what you're going to get today. And so, yeah, so I always like the the scripture, let your yes, yes, and your no be no. Say what you mean.
Yeah, no, I can remember some of the teachers, sometimes they were teachers that had a real hard time in the classroom. And sometimes it was the level of sarcasm they used in interacting.
There's a lot of teachers that think that that's like, and on one side, it's like, I use sarcasm usually just to deflect the seriousness of the situation when I'm talking about climate change or whatever, because it's the only way I can deal with the fact that, chaos is in the world and there are things that we can't control. And it's like, but, it will all be well. I don't know. I mean, I have to like somewhere find a way to bring it back though and say, okay, it's like the things, we can do things to make improvement. But they're just moments. It's like, how do I deal with this in any way other than that? Because it's like so much outside of any of our control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's reached that point.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't use sarcasm with students. I think that's the thing that I see or hear or whatever. And it's like snapping, or it's like if you do that at the students, again, the students aren't going to trust you.
All right, so the commentator had a couple of things to note about this passage. Right. One is going back to that first sentence, first verse about the teachers bearing in mind that and he uses that inclusive we, all right, that we shall receive a stricter judgment, which is, and that, is that what you NRSV used, judgment?
Let's see here.
Verse 1.
Let's see, for you,
Says, we will
will
be
be judged with greater strictness. Yeah.
With greater strictness.
Yeah.
Okay. They were saying that the literal translation is greater judgment.
Well, it says judged, so.
Judged with, yeah.
So, anyhow, and then as it get into the passage using the analogy of the rudder and the boat, and what was the other one?
The
Flame,
The bit in the
the bit,
horse's mouth.
the bit in the horse's mouth, that using sort of these images from nature, so to speak, or day-to-day life. So,
Well, I do want to say, it's like we have not, as human beings, tamed all of the animals.
No,
There is far, it's like, we might have tamed a few of them, but they were like wanting to be tamed. They sort of like have a choice in this. It was a mutual relationship that was developed between
yeah, they
human
had
and
that,
animal.
not cats.
No, but it's like when they're talking about reptiles, what reptile has been tamed? I mean, seriously.
well, the point I was trying to get to is that
The whole
this kind of
bit thing.
language
It's
is
like
not
the big thing in the teacher's mouth that hurts.
true. That
And
would.
it does hurt, and that's what we have to deal with in the school system, is like feeling like you've got a bit in your mouth because they are, it's like there are things that you're not allowed to talk about, or that are real things sometimes.
Yeah.
Um,
There's some things that need to be approached with judiciousness, and
Absolutely.
there are other times that, on somebody's whim. But anyhow, these images, though, are not typical of what we see in other New Testament writings. They're more what we see in wisdom writings. Remember, we did the wisdom stuff. We've done a little bit from the Old Testament. That those are analogies or images that you see more from, that you see more often in the wisdom literature. And we already know that Jacob James, uses a lot of references to Proverbs and that kind of thing. So,
All right, I do remember that it's Proverbs 1-9 that he's.
yes, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs
Yeah,
that he
so
refers to.
I wouldn't have come up with that, but once you said it, I remembered the numbers.
Oh, good. Okay.
The weird things that stick in my brain.
All right. So these seemingly smaller parts, like the rudder, the bit, and the tongue, and how they have a lot of power. They have a lot of power. So I thought his imagery of how to control your speech, control your tongue, you're controlling your whole body, which it's an interesting image to have.
Yeah, because I've always thought kind of if you think it, then you say it, and then you do it. And so he's kind of starting, without saying so, he's kind of, you've got to control how you think, which controls how you think, and what you say, and then it controls what you do.
All right, anybody want to add anything else before we go to the next passage?
All right, verses 13 through 18,
And,
which mine is titled Real Wisdom and its Opposite.
okay,
All right, Sarah.
who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace.
Yeah, mine says the peace shown by peacemakers brings a harvest of justice.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
So, all right, so he's addressing problem kind of behaviors, and it seems like he's talking more about the community kind of thing.
You know, a lot too. I saw a thing the other day that I think was Finland, where some of the happiest people, you know, when they survey, there's more happy people. And one thing is, they just aren't covetous. They don't have to have what everybody else has. Nobody, that's not the point of living. They said the very most wealthy people will take their child out in a pram and walk it and take the bus and everything. There's no pride of things, you know, and which really goes a long way, you know, kind of starting with 10 Commandments, just not covet things, you know. If you don't feel like you have to have things, and our society has found itself just deeply rooted in trying to implant the idea that you need these things.
Right, your quality of
need-
life
You
depends on
need
it.
status by having things, you know.
Although I think the younger folks these days have figured out that that doesn't work.
Yeah, everybody kind of figures, if you're lucky, you figure it out.
The question is, how long will they have that figured out once they're in the workforce?
Yeah.
It's like, it's a competition-based system. It's designed to encourage competition, like whether you're talking about the workforce or like even like in the school system. I mean, you don't, you know, play a sport just for the sake of playing the sport. You play the sport to win, and if you're not winning, then you're not, you know, as happy. And it's like our society is so much based on competition and winning and you know. And it's like one of the things I love about, you know, socialist systems is you have a sense that your basic needs are going to be supported. You're going to have the health care. You're going to have, you know, some, you know, mental health care, physical health care. You know, it's like there's so many of these, you know, things that you don't. And it's like in Canada, they've got like the childcare from like early on, and a lot of the countries have like the early childcare. You've got the maternity, paternity leave that's much longer and paid for, and care and support of the families and of the individuals, and you feel loved by the system in a sense. And we create a system that doesn't support that. Here as well, built around, you know, how much can I get so that I don't have to be afraid.
I'm like,
Oh,
because I'm remembering, and I don't watch Oprah more than once every 3 or 4 years, but watching an Oprah show where an unwed red mother stood up and said she got pregnant as often as she could, because the more babies she had, the more money she got.
And there were folks that do that,
Yeah.
but there are an awful lot of folks that don't.
Right,
Yeah.
and I understand, and that's part of my problem. I understand there are people who through no fault of their own are in need.
And if you have.
But
to
I've
help
got
them,
I've
Yeah.
got great nieces and nephews
Yeah.
who are just making stupid life choices.
Oh, yeah, no, and I've heard that from you too before. And
And it's killing my sister because they
Yeah.
come to her going, Brandy, I need money. And
Yeah.
she's thinking, you put yourself in this position
Mhm.
and you want me to ruin my retirement
yeah,
to bail you out again.
yeah.
And she's to the point, she doesn't answer the phone when one girl calls.
And the problem, as much as anything, is that while, it's like, while those people are hurting themselves, they're hurting their children too. And we don't have a system that supports and
Yeah.
enables the children. And
Yeah.
it's like, and
Yeah, 2 of her kids are lucky that their paternal grandmother is raising them.
yeah, yeah. And, and I don't think that, handing more money out is necessarily the right answer. I think having community housing with childcare and providing, education on how to get jobs, or, it's like expectation of, supporting jobs in the community for those parents. Because the purpose of the childcare is not so the parent can go out and get pregnant again. The purpose of the childcare is
So
so
they can
that
go
the
work,
parent can go
yes.
work. And in most cases, that's what's going to happen in order to
Yeah.
be able to have a better living situation for the family. But yeah, no. And
there
in
have
those
been-
cases, you're talking about somebody that needs therapy.
Right.
A lot of therapy.
30 years
Yes.
ago, 30 years ago, there was a major shift in the legislation for public assistance.
Mhm.
And so there have been significant changes as a result of that. So there are still some folks that see it that way, but I think there have been some major shifts. In that you have to take, because there are time limits now on how long you can receive
Mhm.
temporary
Okay.
assistance to needy families. I mean, it's, there are some circumstances there that there, but anyhow, for the most part, they're very specific. So anyhow, we have to be careful that we don't take one situation and blanket that to, that's
Right.
how everybody
And
lives.
I understand that, but also I'll give you another example. In class, and was talking about, my life history, trying to give my students, you're not always going to be in this mess.
Mhm.
And I made the statement that as a young married person, for about 3 months, I was on food stamps and was horribly embarrassed, never told my parents, got off as fast as possible. Well, at Virginia State, 95% of those students are on financial aid, and a large proportion of them, and I don't have a number, but they came from the projects. And one of my better students sitting right under my nose, front row, said, why were you embarrassed? Why did you want to get off of food stamps? And I said, because that's just the way I was raised. That I was, I didn't do anything judgmental. I was raised that way, that I'm supposed to support myself, and left it at that. But he was just amazed that anybody would want to be off of food stamps. I could see him going, huh?
Well, and I think, if you're coming from an atmosphere of poverty also, I mean, it's like you would
And-
want to be on food stamps, and that is helpful for you and your family. And the idea of being able to have enough money sometimes to be able to support yourself might actually be so foreign.
Right, and
Yeah.
I guess that's really
It's a
more
whole
my
different
problem
world.
than my great niece.
Yeah.
Because I taught these kids, and for a while I was teaching personal money management, and I used to ask them to tell their money story, just to kind of see where they were. And most of those stories were coming from very low income backgrounds. So me trying to tell them how to buy a house or have a will or plan an estate, was a waste of time, but it was a job that paid me.
But you introduce those concepts.
Right, I introduced
In
those
that box.
concepts.
And
But
saving.
one of
yeah.
the kids, funny story, this one was an aha moment for me. He said he wanted to be like his parents because he knew they were good money managers, because the electricity had never been turned off in his apartment.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was an aha, because I grew up in a world where nobody ever never had the electricity turned off.
Right.
So that kind of,
And then
Thank you.
Good to see you.
so I don't know what the answer.
Yeah, I don't
bothers me
either.
a
I mean,
lot.
I spent 40 years as a social worker with that debate in my head all the time.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not an easy answer, but I think, so what does this passage say to us about how we approach it? You know, Jacob talks about the four the four negative traits like jealousy, ambition, disharmony, and wickedness. All right, I think it's translated a little bit different in the NRSV, but versus being peaceable, kindly, and considerate, and showing mercy and doing good.
Yeah, you know, Lynn, my wife, is just like a constant stream of embarrassment for me, you know, because she is just compassionate. You know, she just naturally
Yeah.
wants to help, wants to give mercy. She doesn't worry about whether it's might be wrong or it might not deserve it or something. It just flows out.
I remember one of your sermons. Do you cringe every time I say that? Where you talked about, giving to the poor. And it wasn't our responsibility what they did with their money once we gave it. And that stuck with me because I wanted to make sure, if I give you money for food, I want to make sure you go buy food with it. Or on clothes or, extra socks or a coat.
Yeah, we look for things that when we give that we think are going to be productive, but at the same time, when if we start going into some kind of intimate detail, she goes, I'm letting it go. Let God
Yeah.
take care of it.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
we've made a choice, just move it into the world
Yeah.
with good heart and let our heart and
Yeah.
spirit take it, do the best.
I'm getting better at that as I
Yeah.
get older,
Yeah,
but it's a challenge for
difficult.
me.
But tell you what,
On the other hand, if you give somebody on the street who's panhandling money and it pays for the fentanyl or the alcohol that kills them, are we not responsible for that?
Yeah, because I do think we have some responsibility in terms of how we give.
she doesn't do that.
Oh. All right, well, these verses lead into the next passage. Sure, give us a heads up for the next passage. All right, so chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Someone would read those. Somebody on the Zoom? Nope. Okay, I'll read it. All right.
I don't mind reading it again. You're talking.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Okay. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Adulterers, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you suppose that it is for nothing that the scripture says, God yearns jealously for the spirit that he has made to dwell in us, but he gives all the more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Okay.
We just got smacked down.
Did y'all hear what Sarah said? We just got smacked down. Yep. Yep. So, yeah, mine says it pretty strongly too. You want something and you lack it, so you kill.
You have ambition that you cannot satisfy, so you fight to get your way by force.
And then it doesn't make you happy. You know, that's the thing, is what does make you happy? You keep thinking things will make you happy, they don't.
Right.
So you keep going after more and
Yeah,
more,
yeah,
because people don't figure that out.
right.
Mhm. Right. Right. All right, so an interesting point to me to make in verse 4, mine just starts off with that word adulterers, exclamation mark.
Yes.
Okay, well, interestingly, in the Greek, first of all, back up, you know, in Spanish and French and Latin, there's the feminine form of, and there's in Greek too, feminine masculine form. So that adulterers in the Greek is feminine.
Oh.
Shocker.
Yeah.
My Bible says unfaithful people.
Yeah. All right. So, that the commentator said that verse, adulterers, do you not realize that love for the world is hatred for God? Anyone who chooses the world for a friend is constituted an enemy of God. All right, that it may be that what he's talking about there is reflecting back on Israel being unfaithful to God, perhaps. That may be what he's thinking about there. All right, and then an interesting piece about verse 5. Can you not see the point of the saying in scripture? And then it's a quote. I mean, my Bible has it in quotation marks. The longing of the Spirit he sent to dwell in us is a jealous longing. All right, there's a little bit of a problem with this in that quote can't be found in the Bible. So my Bible has a footnote for that verse, and it has a number of verses in other places that it tries to suggest that maybe that verse is speaking to, but so there's a anyhow, so it can't be. So there's also a question as far as how to translate that verse. That it could be translated a couple of different ways. That it could be translated as two sentences. Or do you think the Spirit speaks vainly? And the Spirit which God causes to dwell in us yearns jealously. It still is an awkward. So anyhow, so just an interesting aside that
My footnote points out that God's jealous, the word jealous.
Remember that a lot of James is really based on the Sermon on the Mount. And we have the Beatitudes and everything about constantly comparing the humble, the meek will inherit the earth versus the proud. So I think that it might be, the scripture says God opposes the proud but also favors the humble, might be reflecting the whole message of the sermon.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. All right, so we get this pretty, as Sarah said, smackdown. All right. The next passage, all right, the next set of verses, take it in a little bit different tone, and I'll go ahead and read this. But he has given us an even greater grace. As scripture said, God opposes the proud, but he accords his favor to the humble. Give in to God then, resist the devil, and he will run away from you. The nearer you go to God, the nearer God will come to you. Clean your hands, you sinners, and clear your minds, you waverers. Appreciate your wretchedness and weep for it in misery. Your laughter must be turned to grief, your happiness to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. All right, I'm going to pause there. So that last verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up.
That comes from Matthew 23, verse 12. So. He accords his favor to the humble. I like that. The nearer you go to God, the nearer God will come to you. How do y'all's Bibles translate that?
What verse is that?
Yeah, I couldn't quite tell where you were starting.
Oh, verse
Yeah,
8.
okay.
The nearer you go to God, the nearer God will come to you.
Draw near to God and he will draw near to you.
Okay.
Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded.
You double-minded.
Yeah.
Waivers, double-minded. Yep. Appreciate your wretchedness and weep for it in misery.
This reminds me, and I'm not gonna remember it completely, of a parable or a fable type story of a young boy traveling with his grandfather. And they stopped to rest, and the grandfather said, you can go out and explore, but don't go too far, because I won't be able to get. And the kid, basically it was, well, how far can I go? And the grandfather said, I'll always be waiting for you, but I'm not gonna, but you can get out of my reach. You need to make sure you stand, the closer you are to me, the more I can take care of you. And that comes to mind when I read this.
It reminds me of the upcoming Ash Wednesday that, you know, appreciate your wretchedness. I was, that was what caught my mind was know who you are, your weaknesses and your failings, and give me a clean heart, oh God, that scripture, you know, that we are humbly coming before God with all that we are, in wanting God to cleanse us so that we can draw close to God.
Yeah.
It bothers me to say, you know, grieve and mourn and don't laugh, because I kind of think laughing is really a kind of a key sign that you know God.
Yes,
Yes,
well, and
agreed.
yeah, I
But-
think that's in there too, but
Really?
also don't act like you don't need to grieve.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
When Lindy prays every morning and she cries every morning. She said, I can't help it.
I
you
can
know.
relate to that. Okay.
Yeah, she says she had, you know, she's thinking about everybody in need and big time things.
Yeah, when I'm doing the, you know, that our chain of prayer. And,
Oh, yeah.
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 Oh, we've done it.
cool. I like the, oh, dark 30, it's quiet.
Yeah, good.
And, but yeah, I spend most of my time in the sanctuary in tears.
Right.
I say church is a great place to cry.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I
It's
cry
like-
more during communion than I have any other place in my life.
Yeah. Mhm.
All right, so the commentators make the point about how in these verses, the author's not talking about the rituals or the law. He's talking about moral actions and behaviors. So, all right, so the last two verses for today, verses 11 and 12. Brothers, do not slander one another. Anyone who slanders a brother or condemns one is speaking against the law and condemning the law. So he wasn't there, but he is now. But if you condemn the law, you have ceased to be subject to it and become a judge over it. There is only one lawgiver, and he is the only judge and has the power to save or to destroy it. Who are you to give a verdict on your neighbor? Who do you think you are? Yeah. Now remember, wasn't it in James? Oh, yeah, it was back in chapter 2, where he said, if you violate one part of the law, you have
Violated the whole thing.
you violated the whole thing. Yeah. So, one thing I don't think we've talked about that I had read in preparation for this was that this book, Jacob or James, was one of the last, if not the last, to be incorporated as part of the canon or the official books of the Bible. That there was a lot of debate for quite some time whether or not to include it.
And see why.
Yeah, I haven't read it much about what all the argument was, but it apparently went on for some time. You know, as far as whether or not it should be part of the Bible for whatever reason. So anyhow. But, all right, anything anybody else wants to add before we wrap up for today? Yeah, so I think you'll be able to finish James next week.